Oftentimes, the child in these narratives would wither away and die. The only way to have the human child returned by the fairies would be to, unfortunately, abuse the changeling. And so the fairies would say, oh, one of our kind is being hurt, let's make the exchange and save them. This unambiguously led to a lot of child abuse and infanticide in a lot of populations, especially in Ireland. I think that's always important to emphasize. But I do think it's interesting that a lot of these changelings, after the changeling was abused and returned, the returned child would grow up to be a spiritual person, sometimes a priest, or sometimes a seer or a fairy doctor themselves. And that sort of has some similarities to some lines of speculation in the abduction scenario, where they suggest that childhood trauma causes an enhanced capacity for dissociation, which allows people to have these experiences like alien abductions. And
welcome back. I'm here again with Joshua Cutchin. Joshua, welcome back.
It's good to be back.
I called you Joshua this time, even though I'll continue calling you Josh. But anyway, I'm trying to be formal and informal at the same time.
Like I say, call me anything but late for breakfast. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, so last episode, we talked a little bit about theories of Sasquatch and what it might be. Let's dive into a completely different realm. I noticed on your YouTube channel, you had taken a trip to Ireland to view some stuff and do some things. What was that all about, and what were you researching?
Well, I think that it's one of the most beautiful countries in the world. I haven't been to a ton of them, but from what I can tell, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. So that was the primary motivator, or at least one of the convincing points that got my wife to go with me. But another reason that I wanted to go there was because I have, for whatever reason, I can't really pinpoint where this started, I've always had a fascination with the faithful, with the little people. And that is a journey that has paid off in dividends. You can find little people legends in a vast majority of cultures around the world. A lot of them exhibit very similar qualities. But where I've really found the most reward has been in extending some of the observations made by Jacques Vallée in his 1969 work, Passport to Magonia, where he illustrated that there seems to be a common thread between these older ways of understanding the other and the way that we talk about UFOs today. So I got to go over to Ireland and see a bunch of fairy forts, which is just, to everybody else, they look like hills and a bunch of toppled stones. But to me, it's like my favorite places. So I was fortunate enough to visit several sites. Also went out to Loch Gur, which is home to the largest stone circle in Ireland. And it's just amazing to see how those traditions remain alive, not only in the landscape, but also in the culture. I remember speaking to someone in a bar, like a young person, right, in a pub over there, and they said, of course, I don't believe in fairies, but I'm terrified of them. And the average person that you would meet in a pub over there probably would not overnight in a fairy fort for a king's ransom. So there is a real sense of continuing that legacy into the modern era. And I would argue that in a lot of ways it continues in a much more visible way with the UFO phenomenon.
Now, okay, let's step back a little bit. You said a number of things. For folks who don't cover this topic, don't know anything about the good people, the little people, whatever you want to call them, what is a fairy fort?
So this sort of ties up into the ambiguity of what the fairies are to begin with. So I'll start with that, and then I'll move to the fairy fort question.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
Exactly what the fairies are First of all, abandon all your ideas of Tinkerbell and other Disney fairies. That's a children's
That's
book
actually the hardest
connection.
thing for me. It's just like, that's why I say the fae. Notice in the language that I use,
right,
I don't say fairy, I say fae, I say good people, little people, etc.
No, I find myself doing the exact same thing, and it gets even more difficult because there are some contemporary fairy encounters that show Disney fairies, which to me implies that there's some sort of co-creation going on between the witness and whatever they're encountering. But setting that aside for the moment, fairies were understood as a race of beings, most often spirit beings, and they were recognized by their shared attributes that they had across a lot of different areas. We can focus on the traditions from Western Europe, which were especially rich, but again, as I will reiterate, you can find these traditions in a lot of places around the world, but going by different names. Typically, not as a rule, but typically, or I guess as a rule, but not exclusively, they happen to live underground at the margins of society, would kidnap or abduct vulnerable members of society, as well as people who seemed to be above being abducted. They had a preoccupation with human children to the extent that sometimes they would procreate with human beings. Typically short, but not by any means exclusively short. You find plenty of allusions to them being much taller and being size and shape shifters as well. There were often certain food taboos that were associated with interacting with them. They would be blamed for all sorts of supernatural phenomena in general, to the extent that an argument could be made that a lot of our ancestors once used the term, oh, that's fairy, like we would call something paranormal or supernatural. Now, as far as what they were on like an objective level, that is still a subject of much debate amongst fairy scholars. There's an interpretation that they are nature elementals, the spirits of living things that are made manifest. There's another argument that they are demoted pagan gods or lesser pagan deities or the spirits of a certain place. Christianity comes along and says that they're akin to demons, or they're the angels that were too good for hell and too bad for heaven, or the angels that were shut out of heaven and hell during the great battle between heaven and hell. Then there's another line of speculation, which I find extremely interesting and also plays into what fairy forts are, to return to our original question, that they were closely associated with the human dead, either functioning in some capacity with the transition of humans into the afterlife, or that you could die and become a fairy, or that fairies were just straight up the human dead. That was the way that a lot of these communities thought about fairies prior to the rise of theosophy in the late 19th century. Keeping in line with that modality through which fairies were understood to have some sort of relationship with the human dead, a lot of these fairy sites are unambiguously created by human beings. A lot of them are ring forts or hill forts, typically Neolithic or I believe Iron Age. And you'll find them scattered all across Ireland and the British Isles. I believe the conservative estimate for the amount of ring forts in Ireland at one point was around, I believe, this might be a little bit low, so I'm kind of skewing my memory low here, 60,000 ring forts, and Ireland is roughly the size of Indiana, to give people an idea of the density that we saw there. And again, these were unambiguously made by human hands, but we don't know a ton about the builders. Other times, fairy sites can be hills that were associated with just strange activity, like anomalous lights and people going missing atop these hills and mountains. Again, there's another connection to the dead there, because you do find references to the dead going into mountains and hills in various mythologies. So it's interesting to take a look at, why are the fairies in these old sites of human habitation? And of course, there's the possibility that they are human in a different transmuted form. Or there are some illusions that you'll find in some of the ethnographies of the fairies moving into these human spaces after they've been abandoned as well. So that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of what fairy forts are.
Isn't there some apocryphal story, maybe it's a real story, of the Kennedy family camping out at one of these fairy forts?
That doesn't come to mind readily. But I did mention that I went to Loch Gur, and Loch Gur is right where the President Kennedy lineage, that's exactly where they were located, was right on the banks of Loch Gur, which is one of the most celebrated fairy sites in Ireland in terms of the number of myths and legends that are around it. So it would not surprise me in the least that there's something to that story. If you can find it and send it my way, I'd love to see it, because I haven't heard that
yet. To advertise on Through Glass Darkly, email throughglassdarkly@gmail.com.
So where I heard it was I've been to Ireland once, and I went on a tour. It was a tour guide who told this story where they were warned not to sleep there. It was either they slept there or they had a picnic there or they did something within the fairy fort that was foreboding, right? And then the lore is that all the woes that beset the Kennedy family after that were a result of, again, it's very Irish, very,
Right.
So.
But, I think that underscores a really interesting point. As I alluded to earlier with the interaction with the person in the pub, there is still, even into the modern era, a real sense that these things should be handled with care, I guess the best way to put it. There's an apocryphal story that the reason that the DeLorean plant shut down was because they cut down a fairy tree to build the DeLorean plant. Similarly, to this day in Ireland, you'll see older buildings that have the corners cut off, shaved off. And this was because people would erect their houses without consulting any of the local cunning men and cunning women and seers and fairy doctors. They just put up a house and they wouldn't realize that it was actually over a fairy path where the fairies would be traveling nightly as they made their rounds. And of course, as a result of that, people in the household would suffer all sorts of bad luck, from illness to financial misfortune. And so you'd have to have someone come along and say, oh, this is where the fairies go, and then amend your house accordingly, most commonly in the form of a corner that's sort of truncated. Yeah. And that's an important thing to emphasize about the actual nature of fairies. I don't want to paint them all with a bad brush, but capricious is the word that I always use. If you are good to them, they are good to you. If you disrespect them in any way, they can level all sorts of curses at you. And oftentimes in these narratives, the disrespect is not always intentional. Sometimes it's just there's a bunch of unwritten rules that you weren't aware of, and you violate one, and then you have to suffer the consequences.
Hence the capriciousness,
Exactly.
right? You have no idea why they've suddenly turned on you.
Right. And everything from blindness to illness to, again, financial ruin to even being taken by the fairies, which was a very common term that was used in this part of the world.
Now, you mentioned Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée. And in that book, he kind of ties these UFO encounters to fairy lore. And I'm not sure if he's clear as to which one it is. It's kind of, as Jacques Vallée is wont to be, he's very ambiguous. So what do you think about the interplay between the two? Are fairies just ancient UFO encounters, or are modern UFO encounters really the Fae, or is it 5 different things wearing each other's masks? What are some of the theories, and kind of what's your, I think you alluded to your working theory, which is some aspect of the dead, but.
Right. Well, that's something that I've been interested in lately. And I think that there are a lot of connections between all sorts of paranormal phenomena and the dead that do not get enough attention. It's part of why I wrote my last nonfiction book, Ecology of Souls, which explores all these connections. But if we set that aside, which is sort of trying to present an alternative hypothesis to a lot of the stuff that's discussed, I don't think the older fairies were aliens, and I don't think that today's aliens are fairies. I think that both of these terms are culture-specific ways of looking at a phenomenon that we really lack the verbal tools to explore. All I can say is that I think that there are enough consistencies between fairy folklore, worldwide again, but specifically looking at Western Europe and Ireland and the British Isles. I can say that there's enough connections between that and a lot of the UFO abduction stories to say that they seem to be the same phenomenon. And I've got some wiggle room in there, right? Because I think that the UFO phenomenon probably represents a lot of different things, ranging from the explainable to the genuinely unexplainable, up to and including perhaps extraterrestrial visitation. But I think ufology could do itself a good service by separating the amount of times we conflate UFO sightings with alien abductions, because there are plenty of one that do not occur in conjunction with the other. There are plenty of stories where people are in their bedroom and they never see a structured craft, but they have the room fill up with light and they're taken by things that look like grays to another realm. So I think separating those is something that should be entertained, but also just the consistencies that I've found have stacked up over time. Not only the stuff that Vallée pointed out so elegantly in Passport to Magonia, but stuff that I've found since then, just trying to go deeper and deeper and deeper into these connections. In fact, I still remember, if you care to indulge me, the exact moment where I stopped sitting on the fence and I said, okay, yeah, they're the same thing. Would you like for me to talk about that?
Absolutely.
I have been cataloging a lot of these similarities, and there's a certain amount that you could say might be circumstantial, or there are similarities. Maybe they're the same thing. Maybe they sort of manifest in similar ways. But the moment that really hit me was I was doing some research on this phenomenon known as the fairy blast, which was a condition that would manifest, again, if you disrespected the fairies. And in this particular case, the root words for blast, blister, and blustery are all the same. And that's because if you offended the fairies, they would hit you with a fairy blast on a blustery wind gale and leave behind a blister. And when you would open up this blister in these narratives, invariably the wound would be filled with detritus. It would be filled with twigs and bits of rock and maybe teeth and bones or leaves, stuff like that. And that sounds so strikingly similar to the alien implant phenomenon that we see nowadays. And again, that on its own wouldn't necessarily convince me, but that taken in conjunction with about a dozen other things that we could discuss really is what sent me over the edge. Because again, when you look at the work of people like Lear and Daryl Sims, who have really investigated this alien implant phenomenon, whenever it's open and removed, oftentimes it's revealed to be mundane material. And I'm not saying that it isn't an implant of some sort, but I'm saying like the conventional explanation is that it's mundane material. So you still have that sort of core of the way that these things are explained being retained across time and space. So that was the moment when I was like, yeah, it seems like this is the same thing. And again, without putting a label on one or the other and just saying there is an intelligence perhaps outside of us, perhaps self-generated by us, I'm not sure, but there is an intelligence that we have interacted with in a consistent way across time and space, it seems.
And which direction are you leaning?
Well, I tend to look at a lot of the phenomenon that you see in the UFO encounters, and I see so many hallmarks of things that introduce uncertainty into the materialist paradigm. A classic example of this that I've butted heads with some people on over the time, but I think is worth reiterating, is that if you took out every UFO sighting or alien abduction, but even just UFO sightings, even just of lights in the sky, you took out every account that involves telepathy, you're left with a significantly reduced data set. And the very introduction of telepathy into the scenario undermines materialism. And this isn't my conclusion. This is the conclusion of some scientific philosophers I've looked into. They will say that since materialism is at odds with the physicalist paradigm, it doesn't mean that the things that we've learned from materialism isn't true. If you introduce green to a black and white film, it doesn't take away black and white, but you can't say it's a black and white film, right? So things like telepathy, and then you start looking at the high strangeness, the poltergeist effects in people's homes, the similarities of the alien abduction experience to near-death experiences and shamanic initiations. And one of the things that spurred me to write Ecology of Souls, the appearance of the dead in some of these narratives as well, makes me think that there is something more metaphysical going on. So all that being said, I tend to lean more towards today's aliens are fairies, but at the same time, that feels so definite and so self-certain that I hesitate to say that. A lot of what I try to do is to just inject some uncertainty into some of our assumptions that we've made about these phenomena, because I think that it's important to interrogate all aspects, even the ones we might not like, when it comes to the UFO question. I tend to lean more towards these metaphysical explanations for UFOs in general, which makes me more sympathetic to the idea that today's aliens are fairies rather than vice versa, but still retaining or attempting to retain a level of objectivity and just encouraging people to think about these questions in alternate ways, because quite frankly, the extraterrestrial hypothesis has been so dominant for so long, and in some ways hasn't really gotten us much closer to a definite answer, that I think it's worth at least entertaining some of these alternate ideas.
Well, it's also interesting that even in Grush's testimony, he's very careful to use the term non-human intelligences as opposed to extraterrestrials. And tellingly, if you look at the recent era report, it's also very careful to use nothing but the term extraterrestrials. So it might not necessarily be, I mean, even though they got Senator Reid's state wrong, and I think they got the date for one of the sightings.
That seems really hard to do, to get Harry Reid's state wrong, but
there are a number of kind of possible explanations. I don't think that was an
accident,
a mistake.
It could have been messaging in some form.
It could have been a deliberate effort to sabotage the report, to discredit it, from the inside. But anyway,
and then the semantic game that you're referring to as well. Like, no, we said extraterrestrial; they're actually interdimensional. Which I think is a hypothesis not at all inconsistent with whatever the fairies might be, and really, quite frankly, not all that inconsistent with the idea that it somehow has ties to the afterlife. I tend to default to these older, arguably ancient terms like otherworld and fae folk and things like that, because I'm just trying to get back to the interpretation of these things that are the most stripped of contemporary assumptions. But I really don't have a lot of animus towards some of these alternative hypotheses. The only thing that I have trouble sitting with is the literal extraterrestrial hypothesis, which I don't even need to really sort of outline some of the shortcomings of, because other folks like Vallée have done that over the years. But I do believe that there is an objective reality to the phenomenon. The thing that I run into the most with people who will challenge my interpretations are bodies and structured craft, right? Or crash retrievals, more specifically. We do have stories of fairies riding wagons and things through the sky. I mean, that's part of what Passport to Magonia is about. But specifically to the question of crash retrievals, if you look at any of these phenomena, and I'm talking about saints' relics and the fairy phenomenon, even arguably Bigfoot, they've always left behind physical relics of their existence, right? Like, you got hair and flesh sometimes with Bigfoot, you've got finger bones of certain saints, and you have fairy flags and these tiny fairy boots. And I don't think that those are genuine in the sense that there was actually a fairy wearing those boots, but I think that these things are just these artifacts. I would compare them more to the apports that you read in the parapsychological literature that sort of serve to reinforce the existence of these things while not being literally what we are interpreting them as. A good example of this are these saints' relics. Sometimes you'll find that there really was a saint, of course, but there are 12 finger bones scattered around Europe that are in certain reliquaries. And it's like, well, okay, this person didn't have 12 fingers, but yet these finger bones will exhibit strange qualities. People will have religious revelations in their presence. Sometimes there are examples of saints' blood that decongeals on the anniversary of their death or birth or things like that. So these relics can be authentic and inauthentic in the same time. They can be authentic in the fact that they are genuinely anomalous, but inauthentic in the way that they are not the literal representations of what we think that they are. Granted, that is a line of speculation. We might be dealing with crashed flying saucers from Zebel Ganubi. Like, I can't say that that's not the case, but I think, again, if you look at some of the things that people are saying about these metamaterials, that they can't be created on Earth and this and that and the other, there are a few points when people would stop and say, does not created on Earth mean can't be created in our reality? And I think that's something that's worth interrogating.
The interesting thing you said there about these apports, are you familiar with Stephen Mera at all?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the experiment they did with the poltergeist and the coffee mug?
Not that one in particular. Was it sort of a Philip experiment-esque kind of thing, or?
Yeah, a little, kind of. Yeah. So what they did is they had a set of coffee mugs, right, that came in the set, all similar stuff. And in poltergeist activity, often an object will disappear and then reappear somewhere else in a very obvious way, right? You don't see it disappear and you don't see it reappear, but it was on this table. You looked away, now it's gone. And then 2 days later, it shows up in a cupboard somewhere. So what he did was, that happened during an investigation. So they took that mug that had reappeared somewhere else, did a full chemical composition molecular analysis of its structure, and it did the same for another mug in that set. Completely different molecular structure. Completely different. And so while it looked the same, it was not the same. And the next part of the experiment they did is they took this.
I'm writing this down, by the way.
Yeah, they took the supported cup, and you can watch. There's an episode where I interview him where he goes into this, and the research team took the cup, placed it in another location, and the poltergeist activity started occurring in that other location. So he described it as something akin to a quantum anchor. Right. And then eventually the poltergeist kind of, whatever was the mind behind it or the driver behind it, figured out that it was in the wrong place and eventually migrated back to where it had been generating the activity. So there's something to this and kind of serves to buttress part of your argument.
Well, I wasn't aware of that specifically, but thank you for bringing that to my attention because that is fascinating. And I've received a lot of pushback for that interpretation because I do think when people hear me talking about spirits and fairies and mythology made real, they think that I'm implying that the UFO has no physical quality. And that's just not true. I mean, it leaves plenty of physical evidence behind. But at the same time, I think this is based upon this false dichotomy that we've come up with in terms of physical and non-physical and internal and external and mental and physical or whatever.
Again, we get to that vibration thing.
Well, right.
It could be along a spectrum, right? And there's subtle bodies that have some physical weight. And then, again, I'm just talking out of my you-know-what, but it could be the faster an entity vibrates, the less physical it is, and it's a spectrum. It's not binary. It's not on off.
Well, things become more and less true as they progress through that spectrum.
Right.
If you look at something like psi phenomena, which there's been great work in the labs done by Dean Radin and Daryl Bim and folks like that, it's an internal phenomenon that interacts with the consensus reality that we all share. Ghosts leave footprints behind and slam doors. That's one of the things that I ran into with some of the Bigfoot folks is they're like, well, ghosts don't leave footprints. And I'm like, have you read any parapsychology? Like that was one of the first methods of ghost hunting was to spread talcum powder on the floor. And where my line of thought is leading me nowadays is that human beings are predominantly physical with an important psychic component or a part of us in a different vibration, as you alluded to. And I suspect that the UFO might be, if some might be predominantly psychic with an important physical component. And it might be sort of like an inversion of us in some ways. But I am also encouraged by the number of highly placed people in the disclosure movement who are coming forward to defend the supernatural in terms of the discussion and how you can't really separate that from a lot of this other UFO history because it is deeply, deeply tied to and embedded in it. So in case anyone thinks that it has to be just physical flesh and blood aliens in a nuts and bolts spacecraft, that might be a component to it. But unless your disclosure gets really weird, and I'm talking about sort of upending your understanding of reality in some ways, I think it's going to be a partial disclosure at best.
So say more about that. Why a partial disclosure at best?
So if you take a look at a classic example that I sort of mentioned in passing, the amount of times that poltergeist phenomena will manifest in the homes of experiencers, especially abductees. But Belay said that this appeared to be the rule more than the exception. There was a rather sizable study conducted by Martin and Stoner that found the same results, that the large majority of experiencers had poltergeist phenomena pop off in their homes afterwards. The Free Experiences study led by Ray Hernandez also found that there was a lot of this happening whenever people would have experiences with these other beings. And the thing that I alluded to earlier about telepathy being incompatible with materialism, if telepathy is incompatible with materialism, then it falsifies materialism. And if it falsifies materialism, then a lot of different things are on the table in terms of what this stuff could be, up to and including literally your imagination somehow made manifest. I'm not saying I know how that works or that it's even the most likely explanation, but like we've built our complete understanding of reality around the materialist paradigm. And to have that upended is something that I don't know if that would be allowed to be talked about in a UFO press release.
So the intelligence community termed exactly what you talked about, panpsychic collapse.
Panpsychic collapse. So
imagine that everything has some element of consciousness in it, from rocks to bugs to people, etc.
An animist perspective.
But also imagine that every being is in a constant process of co-creation. The very act of disclosing to every human being in the world that we are all, in essence, co-creating.
I see this. Yeah, I see where you're going.
And given all the darkness in the world that's happening, you could end up collapsing the consensus reality in very, very dark ways,
It's
i.e.
like
panpsychic collapse.
yeah, so it's like the only thing buttressing reality. To use buttressing, that's a good word. The only thing buttressing reality is our consensus belief in reality.
Is the illusion that everything we see is concrete and unchangeable.
That's consistent with what you're hearing from some of the highly placed people in the disclosure movement. I would refer to, I believe it was the last time that George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell were on Joe Rogan's show. They mentioned, like, why is this so secret? What is so important that we have to guard this much? You know, if it's just, we can handle aliens, just let us know. And so I think this does speak to the larger ramifications of that. Granted, it's been the focus of a lot of my research in recent years. So again, this is a biased interpretation, but I also wonder if the perseverance of consciousness after death isn't part of the discussion too, and part of the reason for the secrecy, because I can see that revelation undermining authority structures just as much as, you know, the idea that we aren't alone in the universe, or even perhaps more.
Yeah, imagine if the government had to tell us that, yes, we take our orders from the dead, and the dead are just a continuation of the human journey, and they're just much more enlightened than we are, and they're providing us with proper direction. And the follow-on question would be, well, how do you know that's the case? Well, we don't know. Right. It's just out of 75 different instances, they've steered us right in 74. Again, I'm just making this up. Right. I could do this all day. I could come up with, in fact, I'm thinking about really just coming up with a video that talks about why won't our government provide us with full disclosure? And I can think of many, many, many dark reasons why they wouldn't.
Right. Well, and to the other end, a little bit more hopeful end of the spectrum, if there's this revelation tied up with the UFO thing, as I spent 2 full books trying to dissect, if there is a revelation that we do survive in some form or fashion after death, then the ultimate penalty that an authority structure can give you, death, no longer really has quite the same weight that it once did. So you're actively fomenting resistance and rebellion and all these things that authority structures seek to avoid. So,
and let's riff on that even more. You talked about telepathy. Imagine if that is a thing, and suddenly you could read your neighbor's mind, get their bank account numbers, read a politician's mind, find out that, oh man, I thought they were evil, but oh my God, are they even more evil than I
so much worse
possibly imagined? Right. Like in the long run, it would be a wonderful thing for society because you would root out all the sociopaths.
The accountability.
Liars. Right. There'd actually be real accountability, and society would be a little bit fairer. But in the interim, there would be such a chaotic reconciliation with it that how do you get to the other side? It would be pretty ugly.
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely not be fun to live through. And it's something that I really want to emphasize because, again, I run up against this more often than I would care to, is, again, I'm not saying that it's not extraterrestrial or that there's not an extraterrestrial component, right? I mean, this thing, whatever it is, has a certain stellar flavor, right? It seems to be tied up in looking upward into the heavens and all that sort of stuff. But I will say that a lot of the people that are sort of driving this current disclosure season are completely aware of the consciousness connection. Mm-hmm. And they're reading some very interesting literature. Let's put it that way. That's probably all that I can say.
Well, I'll give you a discrete example because it didn't come from the person. It came from somebody associated with the person. So people that you would think of as completely nuts and bolts. And I'm going to drop names. So Chris Mellon, right? If you looked at him, what would you say? Would you say
nuts and bolts? Yeah.
Yeah. Nope. So there's a gentleman. His name is Chris Robinson. Even on my channel, I suspect that given the revelations that he provides, I get the sense that those videos are shadow bans is too strong of a word, but let's just say their audience is artificially limited.
Pushed down. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason I say that, I mean, this guy's has thwarted IRA bombings, worked with MI6 for 30 years, MI5 30 years. he recorded on an affidavit that he had a dream about the Lockerbie bombing before it happened. Like, registered it with Scotland Yard. They discouraged him from doing it. He's like, no, I need to put this in writing. And then it happened. But there was a series of experiments called the God experiments, right, with Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona, where they had him remote view 10 different locations. And there were members of the intelligence community present for these experiments, one of whom was Chris Mellon. And Chris Robinson got everything, 100%, 10 out of 10 targets, right? In fact, he knew what the targets were going to be before they knew what the targets were going to be, because he would get his sparks of insight through dreams, right? And he claims that there are these ETs that provide him with these insights, but he's consistently correct. And what Chris Mellon personally told him, according to Christopher Robinson, is that your ability to do this was better than any of the people that we have. So there are many admissions in that singular statement, but I understand why Chris Mellon would take the hard line, because it's a lot to take. Like, look, I've been looking at this for 2 years, and it's not a very long time, but it became pretty clear very early on that all of this stuff is connected in some way. It's not just nuts and bolts.
I'm really glad that you said that, because it underscores something that I wanted to say, which is I learned an important lesson over the past perhaps year or so, and that has been to soften some of my cynicism towards disclosure. I was thinking that disclosure was going to be a declaration of all the details about what planet they come from and how they use their propulsion systems and things like that. Or, in my understanding of the phenomena, it was going to be coming out and saying exactly what was alluded to, like how the vastness of the scope of this. And it's not about either of those things. It's about putting a fissure in the wall of secrecy and allowing more transparency for these things. And I think that's an achievable goal. The other stuff, I'm not sure if it's ever achievable. But putting a crack in that barrier between ourselves and just what is known, what has been discussed, I think is something that can be accomplished. So I'm eating a bit of crow this year, walking back some of my cynicism.
I don't know. I think you're right to be suspicious about it. My personal view is they're not going to give an inch ever. And I think the only path forward is for people to do some very dangerous things in terms of experimenting with whatever's out there. And, people might die over it, but you know what? Like, our government's supposed to protect us, and they're not, by keeping us in the dark and ignorant. And I think 2023 was the last year that they could have reasonably disclosed this stuff without penalty. Now I think it's no amnesty, no mercy. These people need to go to prison for a very long time. Something's worse, but it's too late. And I think I would just ignore, because I shouldn't even say half, 75% of what they tell us are lies. And there's no reason to expect that they're not going to lie about this either. I think everybody has to go their own path, experiment and tabulate what they can. Like I said, with precognition and stuff like that, like, I'm just experimenting, and it's arguable. Like a skeptic would strongly argue against it, but you just keep collecting data, keep doing experiments, and you just have to figure it out on your own. And if you die in the process, or if it's because it is super dangerous, right? I think it's super dangerous, but the people who are supposed to protect us aren't protecting us.
Well, that resonates strongly with what my stance has historically been on disclosure, which is that you don't need an authority structure to tell you that these things exist. You need to find out for yourself. And that doesn't necessarily mean having a heroic dose of dried mushrooms, and it doesn't necessarily mean calling down UFOs. It can just mean reading, honestly, and talking to experiencers and stuff like that. But that's where the true sort of disclosure happens.
And again, I think the government is flirting with a second kind of Lutheran revolution. I'm a Catholic, right? So I can articulate this, but Catholicism requires the intercession of priests, whereas Martin Luther disintermediated those priests. I think the second Lutherian revolution is that we're just going to disintermediate government. Like, can you think of anything that they do for you? Anyway, I don't want to get into a whole diatribe about that, but I think they're flirting with that right now. After that report, they're absolutely flirting with that. And it seems that the more inanity that they engage in, the more and more they're losing their grip on control.
It's not just the report, it's the report juxtaposed against current geopolitics and environmental issues and all sorts of stuff here at the end of time, as it feels like. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, we're like way far
fairies, right? Fairies.
right. They're very capricious. They took us on a wild ride.
That's what they do. So there is that trickster element that you see in the UFO scenario that is baked right into the fairy folk stuff. Again, I could, if you want to sort of circle back to the fairies and intersection of fairies and UFOs in particular, we can talk about some of those similarities as well.
Yeah,
and some
absolutely.
of the things that I've found out. Well, so the easiest place to start, which is kind of some of the things that Valet hinted at, is that little men in green turned into little green men. There's always been an association with anomalous lights. Something I find interesting about anomalous lights is that they're entirely context dependent. You know, you see them in an old house and it's a ghost. You see them in the sky, it's a UFO. You see them above a Neolithic ring fort and it's a fairy, right? Wands. It sounds like, you know, when we were talking about the sort of reinvention of fairies with the wings and the wands and the very dainty appearance, it seems like wands would be another pop culture affectation, but it's not. It actually stretches back pretty early into Aoshi mythology. And of course, a lot of the UFO occupants throughout time have been seen using wands to paralyze people, which is something else that the fairies
or rods, right? I mean, a rod is just it's just a word for wand that they use in UFO kind of
exactly. And some of the effects are the same. You know, you would be hit with a fairy shot or an elf shot, and you might suffer paralysis of partial of a limb or your entire body. Something I think is really interesting is this idea of being pixie-led. It's this idea that either the Fae folk would lead you astray into places you hadn't been, or they'd render your familiar surroundings otherwise completely unfamiliar. And there's a great example from Dermot McManus of a priest who was walking along a road to visit one of his parishioners in Ireland one evening, and it's a road he's traveled 1,000 times before, and for some reason the opening in the hedgerow that he usually found, he walks for hours and can't find it. Then eventually he's sort of released from that. You'll find this in a lot of UFO literature, even in some of the more nutsy boltsy interpretations of alien abductions from people like Bud Hopkins, where people will say, I turned down this road and I have no idea why I turned down this road, but all of a sudden I went there, and that's where I encountered the craft, was down this road that I had no reason to turn down. You can draw comparisons between crop circles and these sort of fairy rings that you see, you know, the fairies dancing in a circle. At one point, crop circles were called UFO nests, and sure enough, there were circular pixie nests that you used to find in some of the UFO stuff. We had talked about mountains and whatnot, underground environments as being the places where the Fae folk lived. Well, that's part of the UFO mythos as well. Livestock mutilation was once blamed on fairies, but long before it was ever blamed on UFOs. The one that I love and return to often is the missing time component. And you'll hear some people criticize this interpretation. It's one of the things that Valet points out. And I read some criticism from Jerome Clark, who is someone I admire greatly for his contributions to the Fortean world. But Jerry Clark said, missing time in UFO encounters is different than missing time in fairy encounters, because missing time in UFO encounters is amnesia. It's always amnesia. Now, it is true that the fairy examples of missing time are not amnesia. It's all about spending a couple of hours in fairyland and emerging years later, and everyone that you've known has died, and your town is completely transformed by years of your absence. It certainly doesn't happen that dramatically in the UFO literature, and there are plenty of examples where amnesia is certainly implied, but there are a handful of cases where it suggests that there's some sort of temporal anomaly going on. There was a case from the 1950s in Britain, gentleman by the name of Jerry Armstrong, who had a series of abductions. And one of the first experiences he was skipping school and smoking a cigarette, as he did as a kid in the 50s. And he's got the cigarette there, and he's sitting there, and it's dark, but the cigarette is still smoking. And then he discovered the missing time in between. So unless the alien saved his cigarette and relit it, I don't know what that is besides a temporal anomaly in which this abduction, this interaction with intelligence has happened. Similarly, I mentioned Ray Hernandez in the Freeze study. One of Ray's revelatory insights that he had was experiencing this vision of a multi-spoked wheel connecting all these different paranormal topics while sitting in the middle of stop and go traffic in Miami. And he said it took about 15 or 20 minutes, but he was in the middle of rush hour in Miami. I don't think you could sit
And no
there.
one else seemed to notice it.
No one else honked. Yeah, like no one's. Yeah, like the idea that, you know, having been to Miami, the idea that you could sit at a standstill in stop and go traffic without there being an accident up ahead and nobody's going to get out a baseball bat and smash your window in stretches belief. So there does seem to be like some sort of temporal anomalies that happen in conjunction with this, which would be consistent with those older fairy stories. I think it's interesting that if you look at sort of fairy lore, they're all these regional variants and sometimes variants within the region that do certain things, like Pokemon, right? And if you were to believe every UFO experiencer story, we've got 100,000 different species visiting us, right? So it's a reflection of that, I think. I think that the screen memory idea that's talked about so much in modern alien abduction research, a concept that's never really fully explained. Is it technological? Is it metaphysical? Everybody just sort of shrugs, but it does have a precedent with the idea of glamour in fairy folklore, which was a way that they used to disguise things. A very common thing. My first book, A Trojan Feast, was about the exchange of food and drink in these encounters. And oftentimes the food that the fairies would give you would be glamored. So it looked delicious, but it was actually, again, trash. It was worms and bugs and sticks and mud and stuff. Interestingly enough, you know, we're talking about how all these things are connected. One of the things that led me down this path to write A Trojan Feast was I was reading a book by J. Robert Alley called Rain Coast Sasquatch, and he mentions that there's a tribe in Alaska that has a Bigfoot analog known as the Bequas. And if you are to accept food from the Bequas, you'll be trapped with the Bequas forever, which of course is a food taboo that's featured arguably throughout the world, but is certainly something that you hear as one of the primary rules not to violate in fairyland in Western Europe. The interesting thing that gets even more specific about the Bequas is that the food that the Bequas gives you, this Bigfoot gives you, appears to be dried salmon, but the Bequas is actually made tree bark look like dried salmon. So you've got that glamour element in there too. Coming from an Alaskan tribe, and we know about this food taboo from Western Europe, and then the ability for these extraterrestrials, for lack of a better term, to change your surroundings and to implant screen memories, it just seems highly consistent to me. Something we talked about, I'm not sure if it was off air or if it was in this conversation, so I'll repeat it again. Or maybe it was in the last conversation. You'll find these stories of people having experiences and completely unable to wake people up around them. You know, I've collected stories of this happening. Bigfoot and with Yowie in Australia, where there's like a Bigfoot shaking the trailer that people are in, and like literally it's rocking back and forth, and the primary witness is like literally pounding on people to wake them up, and they won't wake up. Well, I mean, we get our idea of the Sandman from the fairy folklore. And there was this idea that fairies had power over sleep. Similarly, that's something that you hear in a lot of these abduction narratives, is that the abductee's spouse or bed partner is completely asleep during the time of their experience. So there seems to be some sort of interaction with that level of consciousness. I did write in 2018 a book called Thieves in the Night, all about supernatural child abduction. And that's just one area where you can really explore a lot of these different similarities. One of the primary motivations for abducting human beings or for procreating with human beings amongst the fairies was that their race was considered to be a dying race and that they needed to infuse their bloodline with fresh human vigor. That's literally the exact same answer that you're given sometimes in some of these abduction narratives. You know, our race is dying, we need human genetic material, etc. And then once you sort of look at the ways, the sort of modalities in which that child abduction and whatnot manifests, you can sort of peel apart other resonances between the two. A lot of these hybrid babies sound a lot like changelings. So in the UFO literature, human-alien hybrids have wispy hair and they're kind of sickly and they have oversized eyes and they're kind of weak. Well, in a lot of these traditions, there were these things known as changelings. We most know about it from folklore from Ireland and Scotland and whatnot, but really changelings, it can be found in for lack of a better term, Bigfoot literature amongst certain tribes, lake monster stories from certain indigenous populations, and also witch tales. But most often you'll hear about it within the fairy context. And the idea was that the fairies would take a human child for the reasons that we enumerated just a moment ago and leave behind something else in its stead. And it would either be an elderly fairy to live out its final days in the comfort of a human home. It would be a sickly fairy infant that was to be raised on human milk, or it was an effigy, a log effigy or a wooden effigy, beglamored to appear like a living human child. Now, in these narratives, it was very common for the child to eat and eat and eat and never be satisfied, to constantly wail and complain, to be sickly, to have these rail-thin arms, sometimes oversized eyes. Interestingly enough, one of the earliest recorded interactions with a changeling came from Martin Luther. You were talking about Martin Luther earlier. He claimed to have encountered a demonic
odd synchronicities. This stuff happens. Yeah. Constantly. Yeah.
But it's interesting to sort of look at a lot of these ideas and juxtapose them with the UFO stuff. For example, just taking one of those three examples that I gave, the idea of the stock or fetch, the effigy that was made to look like a human child. Oftentimes, the child in these narratives would wither away and die. The only way to have the human child returned by the fairies would be to, unfortunately, abuse the changeling. And so the fairies would say, oh, one of our kind is being hurt. Let's make the exchange and save them. This unambiguously led to a lot of child abuse and infanticide in a lot of populations, especially in Ireland. I think that's always important to emphasize. But I do think it's interesting that a lot of these changelings, after the changeling was abused and returned, the returned child would grow up to be a spiritual person, sometimes a priest, or sometimes a seer or a fairy doctor themselves. And that sort of has some similarities to some lines of speculation in the abduction scenario, where they suggest that childhood trauma causes an enhanced capacity for dissociation, which allows people to have these experiences like alien abductions. And a lot of alien abductees find themselves with new senses of mission in terms of like helping the world. And a good example is in Diana Pasulka's book, her new book. She has a lot of people who have had experiences and are now very mission oriented. So it begs the question of whether there was a changeling or not in the first place. One fascinating line of thought, though, referring back to the stock or fetch, the effigy, the wooden effigy that was placed in the crib. As I've mentioned, a lot of these hybrid babies seem to appear similar to fairy changelings. And one of the fairy changelings was this wooden effigy. Some research was conducted by Daryl Sims. Your mileage may vary on his research. That's not exactly why I'm bringing this up. I'm just thinking this is an interesting point. He examined abductees after their experiences under blacklight. And one of the things that he found was that the hands of abductees who had claimed to have handled hybrid babies fluoresced a purplish pink under blacklight. One of the few substances that fluoresces purplish pink under blacklight is also chlorophyll. So,
what color do people typically exhibit if they haven't, quote unquote?
If they haven't, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to a rave, you know, I guess like sort of a darkish blue.
Do I look like I've been to a rave, Josh?
And there was, fair enough. And there were correlations that they made between other experiences and being touched by entities in certain colors. But just focusing on the handling of these hybrid babies and this purplish pink residue on their hands is consistent with how chlorophyll appears under black light. Now, I'm not literally saying that these hybrid babies were wooden effigies that were made by fairies, but I'm saying that there's a symbolic consistency there that you can extrapolate. I don't think they're literally like plant babies that are being handed over aboard spaceships, but it's just an interesting thread to pull on. In addition to that, you can sort of look at the offspring of UFO experiencers and place them into two categories. You've got these hybrids, and you've got star children or indigo children, which people talk about, which in some cases are hybrids. It's kind of murky. It depends on exactly who you talk to. But these indigo and star children are oftentimes exceptionally gifted artistically, and exceptionally intelligent, is how the narrative goes. And as it turns out, you can sort of break these fairy offspring into two categories as well. You've got the changelings, which are sickly like the hybrid children of today, or you have the human fairy offspring, the products of human fairy offspring, who, like indigo and star children, were always highly temperamental, but extremely passionate and gifted in the arts and intelligent and stuff. So it just stacks up. You can only read so many of these similarities and walk away and be like, there's nothing there. There's something there. And again, I've chosen to take the perspective that it is the same thing while also trying to distance myself from putting an exact label on it. Sorry, that was really long-winded, but it really is the gift that keeps on giving in my experience. I think I could probably just focus on fairy UFO connections for the remainder of my days and keep finding new stuff and new angles and new interpretations that really reinforce the fact that this is a very similar relationship.
Aside from UFO or UFO adjacent abductions, contact, whatever you want to call it, do people regularly encounter these things in other contexts? Or at least report encountering these things?
A great deal. And it's somewhat problematic when you're saying, oh, the UFO encounters are just fairy encounters, because we also have a whole separate subset of fairy encounters. Some excellent work has been done on this by Dr. Simon Young, who has compiled 2 fairy censuses, one all the way through 2017 and then one from 2017 to present. And some of them have a UFO flavor. A lot of them don't. Some of them also have a Disney flavor, as I alluded to earlier, which does imply a co-created aspect to these sightings, that there's a give and take in terms of expectations and presentation. But it's interesting. I haven't had the time to really roll up my sleeves and dive into it too much. But from what I understand, the post-2017 sightings are much more aligned with the older ways of thinking about fairies in terms of being capricious, not necessarily tiny, not having wings, those sort of things. I'm going to look into it a bit more, but it seems like it's trending that way, which would be consistent with the renewed interest that we've seen in things like paganism and astrology at a societal level in the West writ large. But yeah, people still do see fairies in a lot of different contexts. And like I said, some of them look like a bit like UFO encounters, but what's always perplexed me about the manifestation of little people in these contexts is that they're always depicted in this sort of clothing from the Middle Ages, right? Vests and pantaloons and things like that, and caps. And their attire hasn't really changed since they were first talked about, which means that when they were seen in the Middle Ages, they were wearing contemporary clothing. You know what I mean? So you'd think if the phenomenon is consistent, they would sort of update their wardrobe, but they haven't. And I don't really know quite what to make of that, heads or tails, but it's interesting.
It could be some time anomaly, right? You talk about time anomalies.
Right. And there are examples of time flowing in the other direction in fairyland, where you stay there for a long time and a short amount of time passes here, but usually it's the other way around. I agree with you strongly that time plays some sort of a role in all this. It has.
Yeah, I think if you try to make it concrete, like if you spend a minute there and then you came back here, there might be days or weeks pass, right? Just because time's moving much more slowly. It's dilated, so to speak, in that realm. Again, that's only if the hypothesis is they're wearing middle-aged clothes, and then I'm making a wild leap of conjecture and saying that,
But I don't think that you're wrong to make that conjecture, because, like I said, I do think time plays a role in this, and that's one of my big regrets in Ecology of Souls. I mean, not really a regret, because the books are long enough as it is, and I didn't want to spend any more time writing them. But time plays a role in this. I had the good fortune of attending an event this past December with Dr. Michael Masters, who's been talking about the possibility that UFO occupants are time travelers from the future. And we had a great time speaking, and it's kind of funny because, like, from the outside, it looks like my idea that UFOs have something to do with the dead and ancestors is opposed to his interpretation, but I think it's just about where you're looking at it on the timeline. Like, I think it's the same idea, just expressed in sort of a different way.
Yeah, look, it could be compatible, right? Yeah. Like, it could be that in the future we figure out that it's
a loop,
like technecromancy or something,
or temporomancy or something. Chronomancy. How about chronomancy?
Yeah. Well, I think he calls them extra tempestrials.
Oh yeah, he does. Yeah, he does. I thought you were trying to come up with a new neologism. Sorry.
No. I'm trying to make the connection of like a future technology that takes advantage of the dead simply just being another phase of the human life cycle.
Well, that's sort of a different rabbit hole that we could sort of walk that has direct ties to the UFO question about afterlife technology and communicating with the afterlife. I mean, in his latest book, Whitley Strieber discusses the possibility that his implant comes not from the visitors themselves, but was designed by EVP pioneer Konstantin Raudove from the afterlife and then placed into his ear, which like really pushes the boundaries of what the Western world accepts about the afterlife in any capacity, but is actually pretty consistent with a lot of indigenous traditions and indigenous perspectives on the afterlife, which was viewed as a mirror image of our world that had the ability to have technological advancement just the same as ours does. And it's a weird concept to try to wrap your head around in general in the West. If you've had a Christian background, it's kind of weird too, or just an Abrahamic background. It's like, that's not the way it works. But there's a lot of allusions to that. And there's a lot of speculation that the UFO itself is some form of afterlife technology. And that speculation goes all the way back to the 50s and 60s when people were talking.
Oh, yeah. And you can also get really creepy with it, right? It could also be really dark, right? So if you look at the Collins Elite, the book by Nick Redfern, that's where they're having visions of these like zombie-like souls scurrying or streaming across the countryside, and these UFOs above that are like just sucking out their souls and consuming them, right?
And that's a thread that winds all the way through the UFO stuff. Lazar alluded to human beings being containers for souls. I believe it's Nigel Kerner was his name, wrote a couple of books dedicated to gray aliens stealing souls. But again, it seems rooted in fairy folklore. There was a relatively localized but much popularized Scottish belief that every 7 years the fairies would rove about the countryside collecting souls to fulfill a debt to the devil. So there do seem to be some of the hallmarks of even something like that between the modern UFO stuff and the older fairy stuff as well. Exactly how widespread that belief was, that the fairies collected souls, seems to have been a bit exaggerated over the years, but it was something that was talked about several centuries ago.
All right, I think we're way over. What are you working on? Let's get into that right now.
Oh my goodness. Well, depending on when this drops, I have a class on the near-death experience that I'm starting to teach on March 23rd through the Cosmos Institute. That's cosmosinstitute.org, Cosmos with a K. And it's 9 classes, 90 minutes each, but we're going to have a Q&A with my friend Shirley Black, who's probably the world's most studied near-death experiencer, and just sort of looking at a lot of the ways that the near-death experience reflects these other contact modalities, like the fairy experience, like the UFO experience, like the shamanic initiation. Again, most of what I do, this interdisciplinary comparative stuff, but I'm really looking forward to that. And so people can learn about that at cosmosinstitute.org. Again, depending on when this drops. I have 3 or 4 projects lined up, some with other people, some by myself. I finally just landed on an idea that I would like to pursue for my next solo project, but I've got a couple of shared books to write with other people between now and then that'll keep me preoccupied. So just more books and playing music in the future, and that's what my next couple of years look like if we all survive.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. We talk about frequencies, and we didn't even get into you being a musician.
Well, we can do that for next time. Time.
All right, my friend. It was an absolute pleasure, and definitely there will be a next time.
Well, sounds good. I had a lot of fun today. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I did too. And I apologize to the audience for taking us like wildly off track at times, but that's kind of where the conversation wandered. So
anyway. Yeah, that's what the UFO does. It pushes you out of your comfort zone.
That's well within my comfort zone, but
fair enough.
Which is, I guess, I'm a strange person. So anyway, thank you again, my friend.
You're very welcome.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and you can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of a expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's two options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.